जय गौरनिताय जय गौरनिताय गौरनिताय जय गौरनिताय जय गौरनिताय 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 जय गौरनिताय किव जय जय गौरचांदे आरती शोभा किव जय जय गौरचांदे आरती शोभा जाह्नवी तटवने जगमनलोभा जाह्नवी तट जगमनलोभा दक्षिणे निताय चा त्वमे गदाधर इव दक्षिणे निताय चा त्वमे गदाधर निकटे अद्वैत श्रेणी वसछत्रधार निकटे अद्वैत श्रेणी वसछत्रधार वसे गौरचांद रत्न सिंहासने शिव बसे तू करता तू मजांगे जोके अच्छे गौरचांद रत्न सिंहासने आरती करे न ब्रह्मा आदि देवगणे आरती करे न ब्रह्मा आदि देवगणे हरे आदि करे चमर डुलाय शिव हरि आदि कोरी चमर डुलाय संजय मुकुंद वासु गोसादि गाय संजय मुकुंद वासु गोसादि गाय शिव शंख बजे घंटा बजे बजे करताल शिव बाजे घंटा बाजे बाजे करताल मधुर मृदंग बाजे परम रसाल मधुर मृदंग बाजे चंद्रजिने वदन उज्ज्वला
कोटि चंद्रजिने वदन उज्ज्वला
गला देशे वनमाल करे छलमाल गला देशे
वनमाला करे छलमाल
शिव शिव सुका नारदा प्रेमे गदगाधा शिव
शिव सुख नारायण प्रेमे गदगाधा
भक्ति विनोद देखे गौरार संपादा
भक्ति विनोद देखे गौरार संपाद
ओ गौरांगेरा रति शोभा जगा जन मन लोभा
आरतिक शोभा जगा जन मन लोभा
गौरांगेरा रति शोभा जग जन मन लोभा
गौरांगे आरतिक शोभा जगा जन मन लोभा
जग जन मन लोभा
जग जन मन लोभा
जग जन मन लोभा
जग जन मन लोभा
नित्य गौर हरि बोल हरि बोल हरि बोल नित्य गौर हरि बोल
नित्य गौर हरि बोल हरि बोल हरि बोल नित्य गौर हरि
नित्य गौर हरि बोल हरि बोल हरि बोल नित्य गौर हरि बोल
नित्य गौर हरि बोल हरि बोल हरि बोल नित्य गौर हरि बोल
जय श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर श्रीवासदि गौर भक्त वृंद जय श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु
नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर शिवासादि गौर भक्तवृंद
जय श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर श्रीवासदि गौर भक्तवृंद
जय श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर शिवासादि गौर भक्तवृंद
हरे कृष्णा हरे कृष्णा 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 हरे 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 राम हरे राम 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 हरे हरे Krishna,
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare
Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Oh, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Oh, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna,
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare
Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Oh, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna.
Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Oh, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Oh, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Rama Rama. Oh, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna. Oh, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare, Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna. Hare Ram, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna. Hare Ram, Ram. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare, Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare, Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare. Kishore, Rama Rama, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Gauranga. Oh, Hare Krishna, Krishna Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna, Krishna Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare, Hare. Jaya Krishna Balaram, Jaya Krishna Balaram, Krishna Balaram, Jaya Krishna Balaram, Jaya. जय गिरि गोवर्धन जय गिरि गोवर्धन गिरि गोवर्धन जय गिरि गोवर्धन जय हरे कृष्णा 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे 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 कृष्णा 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 हरे 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 राम राम हरे 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 कृष्णा जय वृंदावन धाम जय वृंदावन धाम वृंदावन धाम जय वृंदावन धाम जय जय राधे श्याम जय राधे श्याम राधे श्याम जय राधे श्याम जय हरे कृष्णा 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 हरे 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 राम राम हरे 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 कृष्णा हरे कृष्णा कृष्णा हरे 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 राम राम हरे 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 कृष्णा जय किशोर किशोरी जय किशोर किशोरी किशोर किशोरी जय किशोर किशोरी जय जय किशोर किशोरी जय किशोर किशोरी किशोर किशोरी जय किशोर किशोरी जय जय जगन्नाथ जय जगन्नाथ जय बलदेवा जय सुभद्रा ओ जगन्नाथ स्वामी नयन पथगामी भव तुम्हें जय जगन्नाथ ओ जगन्नाथ स्वामी नयन पथगामी भव तुम्हें जगन्नाथ जय गौरानिताय 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 जय जय प्रभुपाद जय जय प्रभुपाद जय जय प्रभु जय जय प्रभुपाद जय जय प्रभुपाद जय निताय गौर हरि बोल निताय गौर हरि बोल
जय ओम विश्वपाद परमहंस परिवाराचार्य श्रोत्र श्री श्रीमद् भक्तिवेदांत स्वामी श्री प्रभुपाद की, इस्कॉन फाउंडर आचार्य श्री प्रभुपाद की, नामाचार्य श्री हरदास ठाकुर की, प्रेम से कहो श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर शिवासादि गौर भक्त वृंद की, श्री राधा कृष्ण गोप गोपीनाथ श्याम कुंड राधा कुंड गिरि गोवर्धन की, श्री वृंदावन मथुरा धाम की, नवद्वीप मायापुर धाम की, पुरुषोत्तम क्षेत्र श्री जगन्नाथपुरी धाम की, गंगा माई यमुना माई की, भक्ति देवी तुलसी देवी की, सामवेद भक्त वृंद की, All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to Shri Guru and Gauranga.
Namaste Narasimhaya. Hiranyakashipurvakshaha Kilatankanakalaye Ito Nasingha Parato Nasingha Yatoya Toya Mitato Nasingha Pahi Nasingha Rudae Nasingha Narasinghamadin Saranam Prapate Napakara Kamala Bare Naka Amarbuta Singha Dalita Hiranyakashipu Tano Bringa Kesavajita Narari Rupa Jai Jagadita Hare Jai Jagadita Hare Jai Jagadita Hare Jaya Narsingh Hare Jaya Narsingh Hare Jaya Narsingh Hare Jaya Narsingh Hare Jaya Prahlad Maharaj Jaya Prahlad Maharaj Jaya Prahlad Maharaj Jaya Bhakta Prahlad Jaya Jaya Prabhupada 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 Jaya Jaya Prabhupada Jaya Jaya Gurudev 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 Jaya Jaya Gurudev Nitai Gora Hari Bol Hari Bol Hari Bol Nitai Gora Hari Bol एकदम विनाशक श्री श्री नरसिंह भगवान की प्रहलाद महाराज की प्रभुपाद की टैगोर प्रेमानंदे
Hare Krishna. श्री श्री किशोर किशोरी भगवान की जय, जगन्नाथ बलदेव सुभद्रा महारानी की जय, श्री गौर निताय की जय। हरे कृष्णा 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 हरे हरे, हरे राम 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 हरे हरे। On behalf of His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada, we welcome you all to Sunday Feast program at Sri Sri Kishore Kishori Temple. Thank you all for joining us today. So before we start, is there anybody who has come for the first time? Okay, we have a small gift for you, so please do keep coming. We have this program every Sunday. Please keep your hands up so that they know where to go. 5 to 8, 5 o'clock we start with a kirtan. We'll have a small talk. Then we'll have vegetarian feast upstairs at 6:30, and they'll have more kirtan here. So please stay back and enjoy the evening. Also, before I start, before we start today's program, I have a quick announcement. If you have kids who are 12 and under, they can actually go down. There is a Sunday school going on there. If they're making too much noise here. Also, we have programs for the kids online. You can see me if you are interested. We have Bhagavad Gita classes for children 8 to 13. This is happening online on Sunday mornings. So if you need any information, you can always come and see me. And for today's class, we have Her Grace Krishna Archana Mataji. We will we will welcome her with a big and loud Hari Bol. Hari Bol. So theme for this month is relevance of Bhagavad Gita in modern world. So it's a new year. We want to understand what our scriptures talk about and how they apply to our lives. So that is what we're going to talk about in this entire month. So we will hear from Her Grace Krishna Archana Mataji. I would request everybody to come a little closer. Please come a little closer this way so that people can walk there behind. Thank you.
Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradhari Yasodanandana Braja Janaranjana Yamunatira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradhari Yasodanandana Braja Janaranjana Yamunatira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradhari Yasodanandana Braja Janaranjana Yamunatira Vanachari Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Kishore Kishori ki jai, Jagannath Baladev Subhadra Marani ki jai, Gonitai ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai. So I'll just do the invocation prayers and then we can proceed to the class. Om Gyana Timirandasya Gananjana Shlakaya Chakshurim Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhistam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swam Rupa Kadamayam Tadati Swapadanti Kam Vandeham Shri Guru Juta Parakamalam Shri Gurum Vaishnavam Shah Shri Rupa Sakajatam Sai Shri Rupa Sagajatam Sahagana Ravatam Vitam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parishna Saitam Krishna Chaitanya Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishaka Vitam Shah Hey Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bando Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tata Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Anchakalpatarubhyas Kripa Sindhubhyeva Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavibhyo Namo Namaha Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimativam Padaswami Tinamine Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimati Bhakti Vedanta Swami Tinamine Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pracharine Nivishesha Sunyavadi Ashita Deshatarine Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Good evening. So the topic that was allocated to me is the relevance of Bhagavad Gita or Krishna consciousness or the philosophy of Krishna consciousness in the modern era. So if one begins and looks at what is that time period that is the modern era, so to speak, and it's actually the current historical period of human history, which refers to the time period after 1500. And up to the 19th century, or these days, since the 1990s, there's been a little switch in the definition, and it refers to events from the 18th century onwards. So the events that are associated with the modern period, this time period from the 18th century to the present time, are events like the Industrial Revolution, the transition to nationalism, and there's various historical events like the French Revolution that was part of that, those two major shifts. So the modern era is also closely associated with the development of individualism, capitalism, and urbanization. So that's what defines the modern era. So there's a belief in the positive possibilities of technological and political progress. So that's the era that we're aware of and that we're residing within. And there's also, at the same time, a concomitant weakening of traditional religious and ethical norms. So the question becomes, how does spiritual knowledge, with the belief in the individual performing work, not for enjoying the fruits of his work, relate to this matter on hand, the whole climate in which we're living? So the matter on hand is the individual seeing himself, and this is part of this capitalistic trend that's been there since the 1900s, and that is that the individual has a profit motive and the individual competes in the marketplace. So there's this modern capitalist system with its market-oriented economy. So we're well aware of this, since that's certainly the whole atmosphere that we are living within. So how does a belief in the mysterious science of a relationship with the Supreme Being relate to this matter that's on hand, of a progressive left or of a conservative right? And what's the importance of a supreme science that's received through a chain of disciplic succession, as it's understood by saintly kings in the climate of technological progress? So those are questions that immediately present themselves. So if we look at what progress implies, generally it implies moving to a higher state of perfection. So then one can consider such a movement towards perfection. So on the material level, in this climate that's characterized by this market economy, there's technical progress, which is in the use of machines. So there's automation in industry, because that is how the capitalist system is operating. And this automation, an example can be the use of conveyor belts. I remember when I was growing up in a different country, we were not so far from a kind of small factory that bottled milk. So I used to see this conveyor belt with the many bottles being filled. So that's an example of some sort of automation in industry. And another one may be something else that improves this kind of operational efficiency and reduces manual labor. There's the example of the usage of industrial robots. So these can perform very repetitive tasks with unmatched speed and precision. So they improve productivity and safety. So those are ideas, examples of something on the technological level that's moving towards supposed progress. You're increasing efficiency, you're increasing safety, you're maximizing production. Now, on the spiritual level, the movement towards perfection is in the form of a ladder. So conceptually, one has to think of a ladder. And it begins from the point at which a living being is in the lowest condition, and that lowest condition, the lowest rung of this ladder on the spiritual level that epitomizes movement towards progress, is a person being fully engrossed in enjoying on a material level. So that's the lowest rung of the ladder of progress on a spiritual level. And as one goes up the ladder, the movement is towards a transcendental state where one is above anything material and one isn't absorbed in material enjoyment. So there are two main divisions of this ladder, and they're known as karma and shanti or peace. So in the 6th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, that supreme being, because that's the movement in the ladder towards a supreme being, because that's the philosophy of Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna emphasizes that the process of karma yoga, or acting in consciousness of him, is better than the Eightfold Yoga system. So this is very interesting, because the generalization made, and it's given by Srila Prabhupada, who's in the disciplic succession, because I mentioned this is the science that's passed down from master to disciple. So Srila Prabhupada in the disciplic succession, he explains that everyone in this world acts to maintain his family, his wife, and their goods. Everyone in this world acts in that way. That means that no one is working without some self-interest. So this is a generalization that applies to everyone. So there's some desire for personal satisfaction through acting in that kind of way. So whether this is for a common immediate center, such as the family, or for a more extended focus, using one's thoughts and energies, it may also be that extended focus maybe for one's country, one's nation. But at any rate, there is that same kind of drive for there's some self-interest involved, and some desire for personal satisfaction. So the main criterion is to move in the direction of spiritual perfection, and that is to act in consciousness of Krishna, some awareness of a supreme being, and not with this view of enjoying the results or the fruit of one's work. So even if one's acting to care for one's material possessions, care for those that are close to one, still there's an underlying self-interest, because one's thinking one's going to also be getting something in return for doing that. So if one continues working if one confines oneself to working to clarify and analyze, one can say that the philosophy of Krishna consciousness generalizes that it is in fact the duty of every living entity to act in consciousness of that supreme being. That's the philosophy of Krishna consciousness. It's a duty, in the same way that it may be a duty to care for persons that are part of one's family, or for the goods one's acquired through one's work. It's actually there's a duty to act in consciousness of the supreme being. And the reason it's a duty is that by one's constitution, each and every living entity, it's actually a part of that whole, is part of that supreme being. So there's an interconnection already existing there. So working for the satisfaction of the supreme whole and not for personal satisfaction makes one a perfect yogi. So this is the very interesting term that's there, because once one connects, once one becomes aware that it's one's duty to act in relation to a supreme being, one is actually on a path of yoga. So in Bhagavad Gita 6.1, Krishna says, this is him himself talking, that same supreme being, he says, one who is unattached to the fruits of his work and who works as he's obliged is in the renounced order of life, and he is the true mystic, not he who lights no fire and performs no duty. So the emphasis is, again, this idea of not being attached to the result of one's work. Because if one's focus in one's work is that one's doing it for the satisfaction of the supreme being, then it's not with that personal motive. It's for myself or for my satisfaction. So Krishna is saying that actually this puts one on the path of becoming a true mystic. And the criterion of success or progress for a person pursuing a higher state of perfection by acting in Krishna consciousness is the satisfaction of Krishna. So that's the criterion of success, that you actually are thinking it's for his satisfaction. So is it possible to pursue this path of a higher state of perfection? One may ask that. If one holds the view that one is the owner of the means of production, because that's what we are taught in the society that we function in, we are the owners of what's being produced. So is it possible to pursue this path of a higher state of perfection, of yogic perfection, if one is holding this view that is prominent in our capitalist society? One is the owner of the production of whatever is produced, and that one has to compete with others. So clearly one has to have a fundamental understanding that he does not have a separate independent reality or identity. So this is the fundamental underlying understanding one has to hold in order to be able to actually make it relevant, the teaching of Krishna or Krishna consciousness philosophy, when one's living in a climate that is putting an emphasis on oneself being the owner of what one produces, and the fact that one is in competition with everybody else. One has to understand that actually one doesn't have an identity that's separate from that supreme being, or separate from this in the sense that one is a part of that supreme being, and it's one's duty to actually perform one's work for his satisfaction. So these are contrasting positions. The climate we find ourselves living in and what the philosophy of Krishna consciousness is teaching, or Lord Krishna's teaching. So if one is thinking in the former way, the way that actually one's the owner of whatever one produces, then one becomes trapped in material energy. And in the latter way of thinking, the one where one's actually looking for the satisfaction or looking to satisfy Lord Krishna, a higher purpose for one's work, then one is aware of the spiritual energy. And you immediately become aware of this just by switching your thinking. And so, if one is able to switch one's thinking in that kind of way, one is actually in a real and natural way of living. It's completely natural. So, what is pertinent in the Krishna consciousness philosophy is explained by Lord Krishna, and this is how he explains it. What is called renunciation, you should know to be the same as yoga. It means you're renouncing that idea that you're the owner of everything you produce. So he says, you should know this to be the same as yoga, or linking oneself with the Supreme, O son of Pandu, because he's addressing Arjuna. For one can never become a yogi unless he renounces the desire for sense gratification. So this opens up a new channel, and we're going to look at this. And this is Bhagavad Gita 6.2, where Krishna says, Sam yam sanyasam iti prahu yogam tam vidhi pandaya na iti asanyasta sankalpo yogi bhavati kashchan. So living in a global climate of either production or consumption of material goods, the absorption in material energy means the senses need to be pleased. Because what is the purpose of actually living in such a climate where there's production going on and consumption going on? It means one's trying to please one's senses. Or give them some satisfaction. You want to please your eyes or your ears or your nose in whichever kind of way. So it's very interesting. In the present time, the United States where we're residing, it's not actually so prominent in terms of manufacturing goods. That is kind of was in the past, but in the present time, it's not the case. And it's actually, one can say, less reliant on manufacturing, but China has become the major manufacturer of goods. And in fact, China surpasses 7 other countries that are manufacturing. So both the US, Germany, India, South Korea, Mexico, and the Russian Federation. So in that climate, one can just imagine the heavy material energy where there's 30% of the manufacturing in the world going on in China. So now being conscious of one's spiritual identity makes it pertinent to consider what tool one has on hand to restrain one's senses, because that's the problem. If you're surrounded by goods, what tool do you have to restrain your senses? You have to think about it. And also, one has to consider how you're going to deal with that hunger that's there for pleasure and the attachment that follows. Once objects have been acquired that give one pleasure, how is one going to deal with that? What tool is on hand to somehow manage that? So there's a teaching from Lord Krishna, again, 6th chapter, the 5th verse, and he says that one should deliver oneself with the help of his purified mind. So that's the tool that has to be used to be able to manage being in this environment where maybe there's not manufacturing, but all those goods that are being manufactured in China are being consumed in the United States, or a large quantity of them. In any item you turn over says made in China. So the tool that's there that Lord Krishna proposes, and this is Krishna conscious philosophy, is that one has to deliver oneself, so a means to manage this kind of hunger for pleasure in some sense object, or getting attached to these objects that one purchases. Krishna says one has to use the purified mind. So it's the mind that can deliver the spirit soul that's residing within the body, because that's the part that one's attending to. One's trying to actually attend to the relationship with the Supreme Being, and that relationship is on the soul level, because that's who we really are. So that's the natural state. So if one takes his mind, then one has to consider that these unlimited desires for material enjoyment have to be dealt with. And it's very pertinent because we're living in this environment of manufacture and consumption of goods. So this mind can either be one's best friend or one's worst enemy. So it's all within one's own control. So generally, the mind is saying, oh, if one goes to any place where one's confronted with goods, one's mind goes, oh, I like that. No, I don't like that. I prefer that. Oh, I prefer that even more. So that's the mind operating. It's kind of scanning things and deciding what it likes and doesn't like. So it can be one's best friend, or it can be one's worst enemy. Because if it's out of control, one may be voraciously consuming, or one actually may be very modest in one's consumption. So as a soul, one is subject to these conditions that are there externally in the material energy, and subject to how the mind is discerning these items in the environment that we're living in. And it's the mind also that has learned certain behavioral patterns. So depending on how one grew up, like for instance, I grew up with parents that had lived through the Second World War. So they were extremely miserly with the acquisition of goods, and anything they had, it had to be used to the maximum. So If it was a pair of shoes, it literally had to be falling apart before a new pair was bought. And this is consciousness that had come because of having gone through a time period in world history where there was a lack of goods. So I grew up with parents thinking like that. So for myself, I find it's very natural to actually be very cautious about acquiring things because I think, okay, it's going to occupy space, and how much am I going to use this? So I'm very, very careful. But that's a result of the mind developing that pattern as a result of growing up in that kind of environment. So the great relevance of the philosophy spoken by Lord Krishna is that one has to look internally. And the mind of the conditioned, and it's called conditioned because of these behavioral patterns that have developed in the mind. So one has to look internally, and the mind of the conditioned soul may be one's best friend or one's worst enemy. So again, reiterating that point, your mind can be helping you functioning in this environment of consumption and manufacture and acquisition and attachment. So Lord Krishna explains clearly, for one who's conquered the mind, you're aware of what those behavioral patterns are in your mind. So you are in charge. Your intelligence is operating. Your intelligence is actually controlling the mind and saying, you may want X, Y, Z, but actually at this present time, X may be the best. You do not need Y and Z. So the mind can be one's best friend, and for one who's failed to do so, who has failed to conquer his mind, Krishna says, the mind is his greatest enemy. So that's Bhagavad Gita 6:6. So how this relates to the view also of individualism is the next question. It's very significant. Is that the individualist view in America has this idealist note. Like, it seems a very commendable value that every individual has a right. So it sounds very commendable. So if we look at this idea of individualism, particularly in America, there's also, however, a much harsher edge to it. And that harsher edge is because of the climate that I've just described, the capitalist climate. There's still this idea of survival of the fittest, and it's also part of our scientific models, the theories that are held on the academic level, which are Darwinian theories, and it's that the fittest will survive. So it's very biological in its view. So even though there's this emphasis on individuality in the United States and the right of the individual, there's also that inbuilt, you're not going to survive unless you're able to compete well. So there's a harsh edge also to that idea. So what is the view, the spiritualist view, or the view that Krishna presents in Bhagavad Gita? And Krishna's pointing out that it's the uncontrolled mind which meditates on sense gratification. And this stimulates material consciousness. So is going back to looking at internally, how are you processing everything that the whole climate that you're living in? So this idea of there being an ideal of a human right, the right to one's individuality, and therefore personal freedom, has a new light shed on the concept. That new light that's shone by Lord Krishna on that supposedly very laudable value, the light Krishna shines has the implication that the mind enslaves one to be thinking of sense gratification when it is uncontrolled, meaning that one's immersed in the material energy. And also, one is looking for enjoyment coming from the actions one performs. So one can see how it's actually so pertinent, the philosophy of Krishna consciousness, that it brings one back to how are you processing everything? With which understanding are you looking at your environment? So the philosophy of Krishna consciousness and Lord Krishna speaking is really pertinent. So in there was this interesting article, and it was written long ago in something called the American Commonwealth, some particular article, 1888. So there was a British ambassador who made his observation, because this is America with the emphasis on individuality and individual rights. And this is how he viewed it, and it's so interesting. He puts it this way: individualism, the love of enterprise, note, and the pride in personal freedom have been observed by Americans, not only their choices, but their peculiar and exclusive possession. So it's even being claimed as belonging to the nation that right. So there's a kind of possessiveness about it. So very interesting. So remember, this is from what Lord Krishna is saying, how the mind is actually looking at things, because it's not necessarily applying intelligence. The mind wants to possess. So even the idea of individual right, it's seen as an American right. There's a possessiveness about it. So you can see how Lord Krishna's teaching is so pertinent. It's like how the mind is processing is how you will actually be viewing even ideals in the society. So how Bhagavad Gita pertains to this climate again that one inhabits, which brings about selfishness. That's the thing. Possessiveness means selfishness. So the climate we're living in brings about selfishness. So Bhagavad Gita reflects on this in that one needs to make spiritual realization one's primary goal. So if one is doing that, thinking one wants to advance in one's connection with the Supreme Being, then naturally one's going to be very attentive to what are those patterns in the mind, how one is processing, how one's interacting with the material energy. So it's very important that one makes spiritual realization one's goal, because if one actually brings one's mind under control, makes one's mind one's friend, and you do that by utilizing the intelligence, you discern what are you going to permit the mind to acquire, what are you going to permit the mind to actually get attached to or not attached to. So if one is shifting to thinking, I'm actually going to try and satisfy Krishna. So if I'm going to purchase something, I want to be able to use it in such a way that I can actually advance in my spiritual life. So this is a very different emphasis, but through having that kind of emphasis, one from within the heart gets spiritual realization. And this is the extraordinary thing. Just through utilizing one's subtle body, the mind and intelligence properly, then there's the super soul within, Lord Krishna within one's heart gives one greater spiritual understanding. One can understand more clearly what's happening in this world. One can understand more clearly how one is actually viewing the world. So by seeing things in relationship with Krishna, one naturally possesses an attitude that's above a material mentality. Just naturally it starts happening. It's no longer a material mentality of I must acquire, I must possess, I must complete, and I want, and this is now mine. One goes beyond that. So by seeing things, all things in relationship with Krishna, and being above the material mentality is something that Krishna explains, and this is how he explains it. A transcendentalist, so that's what one is on the path of, becoming transcendental to the material energy. A transcendentalist should always engage his body, mind, and self in relationship with the Supreme. He should live alone in a secluded place and should always carefully control his mind. He should be free from desires and feelings of possessiveness. There's Krishna saying it directly himself. So that's Bhagavad Gita 6:10. So making spiritual realization one's goal, one can acknowledge the transcendental view of a yogi may be someone who's a meditator, and that meditator can actually take two forms. It can be somebody who's just meditating on the impersonal aspect of Krishna, like a void, where there's no more conflict, no more this wanting, not wanting. It's all neutral. So some kind of avoidist yogic process. It's called the impersonal Brahman. Or one can actually be meditating on the localized super soul, meaning Krishna within one's heart is a super soul. But either way, one is still partially Krishna conscious because it's still purifying that one is thinking in relation to a supreme being. So, of course, as Srila Prabhupada knows, the directly Krishna conscious person is the topmost transcendentalist, because such a person practicing bhakti or having a mood of devotion, he comes to have an understanding that is perfect knowledge of the absolute truth. Just by virtue of the fact that one is in a loving mood, trying to actually make a connection with the Supreme Lord. So it's not done begrudgingly. It's done with wanting to do things in a loving mood with the Supreme Lord. That brings one perfect knowledge. That's the topmost transcendentalist. So the relevance of the Krishna conscious philosophy is that on the path of higher perfection, one has to keep one's mind always on Krishna. So one should always think of Krishna and not forget him, even for a moment. And that may sound impossible, but it's not so, because it's said that it's one's natural state. So when you shift the thinking to actually trying to think to perform your actions in relation to a supreme being, to please that supreme being, then actually it's very natural that you're in the spiritual energy, and it's just there. You're aware. You're always thinking of Krishna. Always have an awareness of Krishna. So this avoids that disturbance by external objects, and with perfect determination, one should not hanker after material things that entangle one in these feelings of possessiveness. So this is very hard. I mean, most of us have a desire for something or other. Like myself, I worked in the fashion field when I was in my 20s in New York City. So it's very natural for me to always be putting outfits together. So I'll be thinking, okay, if I add this color item, this will actually coordinate quite well. So it's just a way of thinking. So, but the idea is that one doesn't want to hanker after material things and therefore get tangled up in getting possessive over things. So the understanding one carries is that everything belongs to Lord Krishna. And from this kind of perspective, one comes to know what one needs to accept and what one should not accept. So one doesn't get self-indulgent. One does things very consciously, deliberately, and carefully. So this is being a yogi and acting in consciousness of Lord Krishna. So that point of perfection is described, and this is Bhagavad Gita 6:28, so again the philosophy of Krishna consciousness. In this way, a self-controlled yogi is liberated from all material contamination and achieves the topmost platform of perfect happiness due to realization of the Supreme Lord. So it's described as extreme happiness that actually comes, spiritual happiness that comes from being able to restrict that kind of indulgence in material objects and the supposed happiness that's there from them, but isn't. It's actually an attachment that happens. So in this stage of perfection, so this is the topmost stage because we're going up a ladder. In this stage of perfection, one can maintain the detachment from sense objects. So one's very detached. One can look at something and one can carefully consider. It's not that one is impelled to immediately acquire. Because of the transcendental happiness that's within. So that's what allows one to become more detached. There's naturally a transcendental spiritual happiness that starts to come. And this happiness is because of the Supreme Lord's potency, because it reveals one's actual identity as a spirit soul and as having that relationship with the Supreme Being. So one comes to realize that the same form, so one may have, one comes to worship Kishore Kishori, so one may think of Kishore Kishori and carry Kishore Kishori within one's heart, or Gaur Nitai, or Lord Jagannath, Baladev and Subhadra. And at the topmost stage, those same deities that one thinks of, they actually come to be none different at the top stage. One fully understands very well those personalities that he was meditating upon. This is part of devotional practice. You cultivate it. So the new reality that opens up for one on a yogic ladder is that one comes to realize the Supreme Lord. One comes to have some understanding of his energies, some understanding of the beautiful way that he's orchestrated the world, some understanding that he's giving one insight in being able to manage one's subtle body, one's mind, one's intelligence. And one comes to see, this is Bhagavad Gita philosophy, one comes to see the super soul of all living entities, that there's super soul residing in everyone's heart, in every living entity, the tree, the plants, the animals, and of course other humans. So now the behavior is to see everyone with equal vision. That becomes the extraordinary new understanding that one has. So one's moved completely away from competing with others. One sees everyone very kindly and with equal vision because there's actually the super soul living within their heart. So one feels happy when he sees others are happy and feels unhappy when he sees others are unhappy. So therefore, one comes to a completely new stage of understanding. One actually desires the welfare for all living beings. So it's a completely, this is the relevance of Bhagavad Gita. There's a complete switch that the final results, you could say, of actually pursuing this yogic ladder, this yogic path, is that one comes to a point of actually wishing the welfare, the good welfare for everybody, for all living entities. And one is able to act in that kind of way. So it's a complete revolution that is the result of Krishna conscious philosophy, and it has great relevance in the particular modern era that we live in, because it actually brings the focus internal and allows for this elevation of consciousness. So what an extraordinary world it would be that we actually come to this point that we truly care about the welfare of every living entity. So that's the topic as far as I was able to explore it. If there's a particular question that has emerged from hearing this or some challenge, please feel free. Oh, okay. Thank you.
You describe the yoga ladder that is presented in the Bhagavad Gita. And then one of the things that you mentioned in the presentation is that the bottom step is when you are still materially invested and there's attachments, there's desires. So that step, and of course, the description of the perfection, the last step of that yoga ladder is very clear, to be, in perfect control of the mind and being fully absorbed in the loving service of the personality of Godhead, in that loving connection. So if we go back to that bottom step, that at least I find myself that I can recognize a lot with that step. I'm assuming that because it's in the yoga ladder is different than not being in the yoga ladder and being fully absorbed in sense gratification, etc., etc. So what is that level? What do we do in that level? When we're in that level, we're not capable of controlling the mind. That one is checked off. I'm not consistent in my connection with Krishna and thinking Krishna all the time. I'm thinking about the stuff that I'm invested with, my material, the material acquisitions and my material desires. So what is described for this type of level to go to the next step, which will be, not necessarily the last one, but the next one?
Oh, well, that's a very relevant question, and certainly I put a lot of emphasis on that lowest ladder or lowest rung of the ladder. So perhaps the most important thing of being on that lowest rung, and you were pointing out that it may be very difficult and even out of the question to control the mind. So the ideal thing is to establish some regular spiritual practice, because that allows for regulation. So one understands that one's mind, or may not be able to understand one's mind perfectly at this point, but one actually can at least think, I'm going to chant one round of the Maha Mantra every day. So just by virtue of the fact that one is making space for Krishna conscious activity, some space in one's day where one's connecting to the Supreme Being, it will automatically slowly be purifying the consciousness. So therefore, one will start to become more aware of what activities one performs every day, how long it takes one to perform particular activities, which activities one wants to reduce or expand. So that would be the very important thing, to set aside some part in the day that is specifically for making that connection with the Supreme Being. And of course, from the in the current age that we live in, the recommendation for making that connection is through the chanting of the Maha Mantra. So if one is able to schedule some time in one's day and make it a goal to chant the Maha Mantra, whether it's one round of, meaning 108 times, one will say the Maha Mantra, or if it will be 4 times, whatever one's capacity is and according to one's schedule. That's a very excellent beginning to bring about the awareness that will lead to indeed coming to understand how one is functioning, how one is thinking, how one's using one's time, how one is dealing with others. Before that, it may not, one is conditioned, meaning that already the behavioral patterns are playing themselves out. One's not even questioning them, not even thinking that something could be altered or reduced, expanded. It may not even, one may not even be conscious or even capable of taking hold of one's own functioning. So that would be the response. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you for speaking. I really enjoyed it. I have one question. So you brought up in modern society how competition is almost like omnipresent, maybe. So my question is, I'm new to the Krishna consciousness in general. Would you say competition in modern society is in discord with the ideals of Krishna consciousness? From personal experience, like in the corporate world, I find it a very aggressive and egotistical pursuit where like I need to do better than XYZ person. I need to rise. I need to fight. So I'm definitely having trouble in my own life coping with that aggressive pursuit, and I think this spiritual nature of the super soul and finding peace.
Yes. Thank you. It's a very relevant question of, you know, how does this competition around one affect one? And you are reflecting on it, which is very much appreciated. And you're reflecting that actually it's impacting negatively. It produces anxiety, perhaps, and discomfort. So, and the whole emphasis, indeed, in the presentation was that that's actually the climate one is living in. That's actually considered the norm. And persons go through the motions of being civil and friendly in inverted commas, but should one in some way appear to be encroaching on something that they perceive as their territory, one is sure to be treated in a most unfriendly way, So it's very thin, the civility, the line between civility and lack of civility is very thin. So it's absolutely essential to actually find that inner strength and put one's shelter in Krishna. That is where one should look for shelter. That's where one should turn for even dealing with, say, competition. Turn to Krishna and one prays, how can I actually find some stability in the position I've been given, the particular strengths I've been given, the particular talents I've been given. How can I actually be peaceful, just utilizing that in service to you, so that I do not actually have to consider that that's under threat from anyone, because it's not under threat. I spoke about the external view of the American idea of individual right, but actually from a transcendental perspective, Krishna has actually placed one in a particular body with particular abilities, with a particular subtle body, and one has to come in touch with that and utilize it for his pleasure, and that's where the strength will come. And you understood correctly that peace comes as a result of taking shelter in the correct spiritual spot. Yeah, so that is the answer for that peace, the internal shelter with Lord Krishna.
Hi. I love the way you speak. I really appreciate you. I was wondering if you're familiar with the teaching of the Ascended Masters, Saint Germain, and then Theosophy, which they all talk about God consciousness or the I am presence. And in my mind, it connects with Krishna consciousness. But you, as a Krishna devotee, would you see it being as a pathway to the same source, God?
I'm not familiar with Saint Germain. There's a church across the street that I think is called Saint Germain's. So I don't know if that's Catholicism. Oh, Theosophy. Okay. So I can't speak because I would have to read so that I can then answer you properly what the similarities and differences are with Krishna consciousness, but at least you are seeing some overlap because obviously you bring in the question up because you've looked at these theosophical teachings. So if you are seeing some overlap, that's tremendous because it means that you already have embarked on looking at the yogic process, and that's excellent. So I give you full encouragement to proceed, and if it's of interest to you, do indeed do a comparison with Krishna conscious philosophy, and that's fine. So you look at both, and at least the most important thing is that there's a supreme being, and one wants to make a connection with that supreme being because that's the yogic process, and that's the philosophy of Krishna consciousness. And no doubt, there's a supreme being also spoken about, perhaps in different terms, perhaps in more impersonal terms, because there's also different yogic processes. So it may not be, with the name Krishna, the all-attractive one. It may just be the merciful one, more impersonal. But at any rate, whichever yogic path one goes on, one is still actually trying to transcend the material energy of Lord Krishna, and that is noble, and that is the correct path for a human. So I encourage you to proceed with what you've understood. Thank you very much for your very kind attention. Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai, and Bhagavad Gita ki jai.
Thank you so much, Krishna Chudamani. A big round of applause for please. So the next part of the program will be Prasadam on the third floor. Please do come back. We'll have Kirtan at 7 o'clock. We do have Kirtan here. Now the kids will be performing if you want to stay back and look at it. But Prasadam will be in the third floor. Thank you so much.